Aunque parezca un poema,
At the risk of sounding like Jacques Prévert, the French poet, let me recite. Potato, maize, tomato, rubber, quinoa, avocado, tobacco, chocolate, coca. The list is long.
Fuera de la coca, los productos antes mencionados han conquistado las
Apart from
mesas y las
coca, these products have conquered the tables and industries of nearly all continents. But I believe only a few people know that they all come from America.
Para que no se me tache de chauvinista, deseo recordar
So as
que
not to be
arroz,
called a
trigo,
chauvinist,
ganado
I should like to add that
vacuno,
rice,
naranjas,
wheat, cattle,
ganado equino,
apples,
caña de
oranges,
azúcar, etc.,
horses and
son
sugarcane
productos de
are
origen
products
foráneo al
originally from
continente
outside the
americano,
Americas.
pero que ya
But
forman
they too
parte
have become an
integrante de
integral
nuestra
part of our
cultura.
culture, an excellent
excelente
example of
ejemplo de
cultural
interpenetration
interpenetration
cultural
or
así.
syncretism. Let us for a moment consider a bush that grows in the Andes of South America, whose leaves were used for religious rites by pre-Columbian civilizations and throughout the reign of the Incas. From colonial times until the present day, indigenous people have chosen these leaves to resist hunger and fatigue. I'm talking about coca. In the 19th century, an alkaloid was extracted from coca leaves called cocaine and used as an analgesic and later as a drug. Coca was also used to produce tonic wines and was one of the original ingredients of Coca-Cola. Anyone visiting Peru can see that even on the most miserable vendors' stalls on the coast, in the highlands or in the jungle, this famous soft drink is sold. Cultural colonization starts with the exchange of food and ends with the exchange of languages. C'est la vie. Since times immemorial, rivers, seas and oceans were routes for conquest and trade. In 1492, the most extraordinary migrations began from the Old World to the New. First came the Spaniards, bringing with them adventurers, traders and slaves. The first colonizers, the conquistadores, set out to consolidate their power by imposing their foreign culture and religion. This imposition, often brutal, obliterated and destroyed much of the native social fabric. Fortunately, not everything ended in disaster and genocide. Bananas and apples, cherimoyas, lettuce, yuccas and granadillas are all to be seen in one of Braun-Vega's paintings. The artist uses the oranges and apples of Cézanne and brings them together with potatoes, tomatoes, spice, corn cobs and avocados, all of them common gastronomical products today. He's putting forward a certain vision of syncretism. To quote his friend, the Peruvian poet Rodolfo Inostroza, the most important chroniclers of Peruvian birth, Garcilaso Inca de la Vega and Guaman Pomoma de Ayala, are also the two great and opposite paradigms of our cultural identity, beginning with the problems created by the Spanish conquest a little less than 500 years ago. But even though their attitudes were irreconcilable, they had in common a destiny of solitude and exile, which has since become the distinctive trait of the ethnically mixed individual straddling two cultures. The native one, which is no longer sufficient to understand the world, which has suddenly grown out of all proportion, and the European one, which there is nowhere to understand rightly if one happens to have been born on the American continent. César Vallejo was just as much of a mestizo and one of the greatest poets which American literature gave to the Spanish language. Julio Ramón Ribero and Alfredo Bryce Echenique are Peruvian writers who have brought modernity and inventiveness to the Spanish language. In 1994, Julio Ramón received the Juan Rulfo Prize, one of the highest distinctions awarded to Hispanic writers. Bryce Echenique is one of the most widely read contemporary Hispanic authors, hailed by the literary world and the general public as one of the most brilliant and disconcerting renovators of literary form. In In the 17th century, a new form of society was being invented in Europe through the transition of a purely feudal system to a bourgeois society. This led to commercial capitalism under political absolutism, which served to rationalize the traditional form of domination. When Rembrandt painted the anatomy lesson of Professor Tulp, he had as the model for the corpse Adrien Adriens, a poor and miserable individual who had been tortured and executed because he had stolen a coat. Those were times of starvation and unemployment. European cities were surrounded by slums, much like third world cities today. We live in a world without memory. Ideological, religious, and ethnic conflicts perpetuate barbarism. Memory or memories can be personal, social, or historical. For several decades now, these three levels of memory have been present in the artist's work. Children and novice adults may apprehend the first level, while the second and third will be understandable to the politically and culturally aware visitors. So as to facilitate the understanding of his work, the artist had to be more exacting and precise. The much freer technique he had used earlier had to be perfected to a point where he succeeded in bringing together in the same pictorial space the most orthodox form of artistic expression and the most contemporary ones. That is, insofar as pictorial realization is concerned. Furthermore, in its conceptual content, his work must be a testimony which will activate the memories of the spectators, who will, with their eyes and reflection, recreate the content according to their individual experience. All this is as much stories as it is history. In this series of drawings and paintings, Braun-Vega has not dealt with the arrival of the Spanish conquerors, which did not interest him. What does interest him and motivates his work are the consequences resulting from the violent multicultural encounter which occurred on the American continent in a short lapse of time after 1492. That encounter brought about interethnic mixing and syncretism which characterized the American identity. And in this, he is most interested in the Andes, and more particularly in Peru. In undertaking this work, the artist is not an outside observer. No, in both his maternal and paternal families, races, cultures and religions of the American, European, African and Asian continents mix with each other. And they are not unique. Such variety of interethnic mixing is frequent among the Peruvian population. When he uses collage or transfers fragments of newspapers, they fulfill, in addition to their usefulness as pictorial elements in the construction of the picture, a communication role. He chooses their content, and in reading these fragments, the spectator can broaden the social or political meaning which the work carries. In the works brought together under the title Perú, España, Memorias al Desnudo, he uses the Spanish masters as far as the historical memory is concerned. He quotes from El Greco, Velázquez, Goya and Picasso, as well as from the Peruvian Guaman Poma de Ayala. When Pope John Paul II disowns the Brazilian Leonardo Boff, one of the proponents of liberation theology, and forbids him to preach while at the same time beatifying the founder of Opus Dei, he clearly indicates the doctrinaire orientation of the Vatican, still close to that of the Cardinal Niño de Guzman, who upon being made Grand Inquisitor in the year 1600 was portrayed by El Greco. Inquisition, conversions, confessions, absolutions and religious imagery have consolidated the power and riches of the Church in Latin America. This state of affairs had already been illustrated by Guaman Poma de Ayala in his time. The artist put into the hand of Innocent X a drawing done by this chronicler in which one can read Indios Cristianos Casados. Casados written with an S means married, but here, written with a Z, it means hunted. When Velázquez was born in 1599, Guaman Poma de Ayala was 65 years old. He had started his pilgrimage through the Peruvian Sierra 15 years earlier, and in a letter to the King of Castile wrote about the real condition of his blood brothers, denouncing the horrors of the conquest. In a mixture of native languages and bad Spanish, he wrote 1,179 pages, the longest letter ever written, illustrated with hundreds of pen drawings. He entitled that letter Primeras Nuevas Crónicas y Buen Gobierno. This manuscript, which never reached the king, was unearthed 3 centuries later, in 1908, by Richard Pietschmann in the Royal Library of Copenhagen, and nobody could say how it ever got there. When Goya produced Los Caprichos and Los Desastres de la Guerra, Guaman Poma de Ayala had been dead for nearly 200 years. Picasso painted Guernica some 120 years after Goya had completed the disasters. As Braun-Vega said earlier, we live through centuries without memory. In these drawings entitled Traga, Corre, Sopla, Muere, he uses these masters to illustrate situations of barbarity which is still going on, and not only in South America. By its apparent simplicity, representing everyday objects and situations, the still life enables him to establish a more dialectic relationship between content and form. For example, the confrontation in the same painting of natural light as reflected in the reliefs and represented light as painted in the more figurative elements of the picture. This is done without break, thus creating a more effective illusionist space. As concerns the narrative content, he brings together the ordinary and the extraordinary. For example, apples and bananas next to carimoyas. A figure by Vermeer, which is foreign to Peruvians, next to some butchers, all in the same space. A Peruvian market, which is exotic for a European. The artist determines the materials to be used for the picture: wood, paint, reliefs, collage, etc., so as to support the pictorial representation of the narration, with the intention of producing a work which is clear in its syncretism. Until the mid-70s, everything was a monologue with his ancestors, reflections on the act of painting, its narrative capacity and the possibility to communicate at different levels without sacrificing the pictorial quality and without being didactic. In 1976, the artist decided to begin a dialogue with his contemporaries, with artists and painters. Using the pretext of portrait painting, he invited his models to participate actively in the execution of the painting, through narrations, through their choice of the surroundings, or through direct intervention in the portrait. For example, Fromager painted directly on the picture the brush strokes which rain on his newspaper. Arroyo organized the elements which appear on the table, photos of his family and objects which he uses in his work. Velikovic drew directly on the picture the graphic part of the background which Braun-Vega had prepared in the style of his model. These are not realist paintings, except in their reality as polychrome objects. Their only realism lies in the model's contribution, which obliges him to adjust the pictorial form and the narrative content of each portrait accordingly. Another example of mestizaje, interethnic and cultural mixing that is, and syncretism.